Hey team, and welcome to a new video in the Astrological Magical Elections video series. Today we're going to talk about the magical electional opportunities that we have available to us between the Pisces New Moon on March 13th and the Libra Full Moon on March 28th. So I'm just kind of going to be honest with you guys. This week, this lunation period is kind of a pathetic showing insofar as magical electional opportunities are concerned. There's not really a whole lot of anything going on. In fact, I only have two charts to share with you guys. And I don't mean like two charts per place, like Western Europe, Australia, North America. I mean like literally just two charts to show you guys. And one of them is kind of like a pity chart because I was afraid I wouldn't have anything to talk about. So I put this one down because it's something that's worth discussing. So not a whole lot going on during this time right now, and that's okay, I guess. Sometimes we have the busy periods where there's some really great things happening, and then these more slow periods where there's not a lot going on, and I guess we should just be thankful that we have anything a lot of times. So we're going to go ahead and kind of get right into it, even though there's not a lot to talk about, and then we'll kind of talk more about some things towards the end. So our first chart we're going to talk about is going to be here for the North American continent. It's going to be for March 23rd at around 2:30 p.m. This chart is set for 1424. And here we have an opportunity for a 10th Lunar Mansion talisman. So the 10th Lunar Mansion is one of my favorite mansions alongside the 3rd, and the 10th Lunar Mansion is one that's primarily involved in healing and health. And this mansion's preferred modality is through healing by increasing the strength and vigor and vitality of the body, sort of like the natural healing, making the body stronger to be able to recover itself, be able to, overcome the illness or the injury or anything like that. It also tends to have an interesting side effect that I've noticed and that other people have reported to me on physicians themselves. So what tends to happen is individuals who carry these talismans have kind of like unorthodox experiences with a doctor, or like some kind of crazy thing happens to where the doctor wants to try something differently, and that ends up being like the solution to the person's illness or problem or something like that. Or for some reason their normal doctor isn't in and they see a different doctor who's able to help them, or who is either able to help them or kind of like specializes in whatever their issue is. There's just some like weird thing to where the 10th Lunar Mansion, alongside helping you recover and be stronger and more healthy, also tends to like put you in the right place at the right time with the right doctor, to get the best results or the best experiences. So definitely a really great talisman to have. And I wasn't initially going to share this chart because there are parts of it that I don't really like, and we can talk about it because it's something that we're going to talk about in a second when we move on to kind of the next thing. But so let's looking at our election here. We've got the moon placed in the 10th Lunar Mansion conjoined the ascendant, like I always like her. The moon also serves as the ruler of the first house, since the first house is in Cancer. And here she's applying this trine. Wow, you'd think by now I'd be good at drawing these lines, but I'm absolutely not. And at the time she's applying this trine to Venus, who is in Aries, conjoined the Sun. And while Venus is a great planet, benefic, definitely a planet that we could lean into when we're dealing with more healing talismans, more health-oriented talismans, we can definitely use Venus. It's the conjunction with the Sun that I find a little worrisome in these situations. So when we're talking about talismanic elections, there are only so many rules that are enumerated to us. Some of them are more standard or primary, and others more secondary. And there are some that aren't really mentioned at all. And so this is one of those instances where I'm not sure it's a great thing, but we can talk about it because there are kind of differing interpretations of what's happening. So typically, in my experiences and kind of the rules that I've set out for myself when I do these elections, is that I want the moon to apply to a planet that can affect the business, is kind of the fancy word, like the fancy kind of verbiage that I use here, but basically a planet that matches or has the power in some way to make whatever we want to happen. And this is something that I've kind of carried over from more general electional practices, something that I do for clients in electional consultations, or even in horary consultations, like things that I would like to see in horary charts that tend to show more positive answers or more positive circumstances. So the moon applying to a benefic planet who's well placed or something like that tends to represent good things, positive developments. And then the moon applying to more malefic planets or planets that are more poorly placed tend to shows things that sour or go badly. Kind of your standard horary interpretation 101. But when we're talking about elections for magic, I carry these ideas over, even though they're not explicitly enumerated or discussed in texts about magic. So I say all that to say that even though Venus here is a benefic planet who is one that I would normally lean to, this trine without the sun there, I'd be like, yeah, let's do this talisman. That's cool. But with the sun this close, what we have is a Venus that is combust. And a planet that's combust is not able to affect its business. So this is something that I kind of take a little bit more seriously, and I usually don't recommend elections. I tend to think horrors with combust planets like this tend to sour or get interrupted somehow by unforeseen things. But basically the idea is that when a planet is combust, its power is subsumed by the sun. So there's that happening with this chart. That is not great. But I'm also open to the idea that different people have different definitions for what does and does not qualify as a planet being combust. So some individuals, especially individuals who follow more like Hellenistic style astrology, will say that a planet that is in the same degree of the sun is Cazimi, and then therefore strengthened by the sun and is beyond the realm of combustion. And you could argue that this is the case here with these two, with the sun and Venus. Even though that phrasing is a little ambiguous in my opinion. So what does it mean for a planet to be in the same degree? Is it a planet that is in literally the same degree of the zodiac, or is it a planet that is a degree away from the sun? So just to kind of showcase this differentiation here, we've got the sun at 3 degrees Aries. Venus is not in 3 degrees Aries. Venus is in 2 degrees Aries. So does this mean that Venus is combust or Cazimi? But even though Venus is not literally within the same degree as the sun, she is within a degree of the sun. Venus is at 2 Aries 45 minutes, and the sun is at 3 Aries 22 minutes. So they're within a degree of each other. So there's some interpretations of this rule and of this definition that would say, okay, Venus is Cazimi, and the moon applying to a Cazimi planet is actually very good, very positive. So if you are open to that interpretation, if that is how you normally view Cazimi planets, then this might actually be a great chart. But if you are somebody who does not prefer that definition, then this might not be a great chart because Venus is combust. So this is kind of the chart that I wanted to talk about because there's some conversations that could be had around Cazimi and the synodic cycle. At what point do we cross the line from one thing to another, which tends to be a little bit more ambiguous in texts. And we'll circle back around. We'll talk more about this and the synodic cycle in general after our next chart. So Western Europe, like I said, does not have any talismanic opportunities for this 2-week period. The skies are just kind of like in a weird web of tangled mess right now. To where the moon's applications tends to ruin things or not be in the right place at the right time. So that's why there's not really a whole lot going on. And maybe I'll do videos like more in the future where I kind of walk through the process and why I rule out certain things. Maybe some of you would find that interesting, kind of me going through like the filming the preparation stage of these videos to kind of see why I don't like certain charts or why I don't like certain days. Maybe that would be a helpful experiment to see. But for Australia, which is where we're talking about now, there is an opportunity on March 15th at around 2:30 p.m. This chart is set for 1439, and it is going to be for a second Lunar Mansion talisman. And the second Lunar Mansion is kind of a fun one that I've had an interesting relationship with over the years. The second Lunar Mansion is one that is primarily focused on sort of feelings of anger, particularly like kind of in the texts, kind of our old-timey texts. They talk about the second Lunar Mansion being used to basically to supplicate a king, like to make a king or an authority figure not be upset with you or target you or anything like that. So that could be helpful then, right? But there's kind of this more general theme of anger and calming anger and forgiveness. So obviously you can still utilize it for its traditional purposes and making authority figures like you or, not target you or anything like that. It might especially be helpful for people who are in litigation and want to get a fair shake from the judge, or individuals who, for whatever reason, kind of get caught up with law enforcement for whatever reason, and don't want to be targeted. That might be an option. But for those of us who are not in those more specialized instances, it more generally has this power to remove anger. So here we're more focused on forgiveness, maybe even helping people who struggle with anger issues, of course, coupled with, conventional methods like therapy and anger management, things like that. But if you feel like you could use an additional tool in the box for coping with anger, or if you, are just feeling like you've noticed that your fuse or your patience is getting shorter and shorter, and you want to get some of that back, second lunar mansion can be very helpful for you. It can be helpful for processing grief or anger and getting to points of forgiveness, either with yourself or forgiving somebody else, and kind of moving past these more difficult traumas that can hang us up and manifest in kind of unexpected ways in our lives when they haven't been fully processed. So definitely recommend second lunar mansion talisman if you're at all dealing with any of these things. There's nothing to be ashamed of for it. But it's just another tool in the box, like I said. So looking at our chart here, we've got the moon placed in the second lunar mansion here on the midheaven, which is very nice. Our ruler of the first house is Mercury here in the 8th house, unafflicted by Saturn or Mars, which is great. And the moon at this time is applying the sextile to Jupiter, who I think is actually, a supremely forgiving planet. And definitely, the opposite of angry in every way, shape, and form. So this is just sort of your standard setup. The ascendant is unafflicted by Mars or Saturn. The lord of the first house is unafflicted by Mars and Saturn. I like that Mars is cadent in this chart, just because it's about like that removal of anger, and there's no better way to remove a planet than just to kind of throw it into the 12th house. So all in all, I think this is a pretty good chart for that. So sort of the big event that's happening during this 2-week period is the Venus Cazimi, which occurs at the same time globally, but of course it'll be different times in different time zones when this happens. So for North America, this happens on March 26th, at 1:58 in the morning. In Western Europe, this happens March 26th at 7:58 in the morning. And then in Australia, this happens March 26th at 17:58, so 5, almost 6 o'clock at night. Well, in the afternoon, I guess it's not really night. But what happens here is that Venus will exactly conjoin the Sun. And, different programs might show this happening at slightly different minutes, depending on whether they round up or down, anything like that. But this is the time that my program shows. So if yours shows you a difference by a couple of minutes, not a big deal. It's just your program is rounding up, whereas mine does not. So Cazimi is kind of taking a step back more and kind of, picking back up that pin that we dropped in the first conversation about the first chart in the North American chart. Cazimis are an important point within a planet's cycle with the sun. So every planet has this synodic cycle, or kind of the cycle that it shares with the sun, best exemplified by the moon, like the lunar phases. The moon goes from waxing, full, waning, to new, as she kind of moves around the sun and reflects the sun's light back to him to certain degrees. But all planets have this. All planets have this phase. All planets go through this in kind of their own unique ways. And when planets come to the conjunction of the sun, this is kind of the restart of this cycle, the restart of their cycle, the end of one, the beginning of another. And it has different kind of symbolic meanings. Most significantly, the synodic cycle is essentially a life cycle of the planet. Obviously, planets are undying, but the closest that they get to dying is the synodic cycle. Specifically, the union with the sun is sort of their moment of death and rebirth. So a planet's synodic cycle is essentially symbolic of a life cycle, and there are kind of 3 significant phases in this cycle. The first is Cazimi. Of course, there are different definitions of when these begin, but I'll just kind of share mine, I guess, the ones that I like. First, there's Cazimi, which is when a planet is within 16 minutes of arc of the sun. This is when a planet is sort of exactly conjoined the sun, represents the union of the sun, and is sort of like the beginning of the next cycle. Then our next step is combustion, where a planet is within 7.5 degrees of the sun. And this represents a time where the planet is hidden, covered up by the light of the sun. And so we have 2 different sections of combustion, right? We've got the planet going into combustion, the planet approaching the sun, or the sun approaching the planet, depending. And this is the bad side that you don't want. This is the side where the planet is dying. This is somebody, like the symbolism here is a man on his deathbed, essentially. Then the planet conjoins the sun, and then, we're filled back up with that vigor of life like a newborn child. And then the other half of combustion, the next 7.5 degrees, represents sort of like the fragility of newborn life. And it's better than being combust on the other side, the dying side, but you're still, very dependent, very fragile. And like I said, the symbolism that's invoked here is usually either the vulnerability of infancy, or kind of like the tenuous strength of an individual who's been ill for a long time and is tending towards recovery. Like, if you've been sick for a while, but you're feeling better, you're not at 100% ready to go, but you're not sick anymore. So there's just kind of like that careful optimism of recovery involved here. And then the third phase is kind of everything else that happens, where the planet is away from the sun and just kind of like living its life, as it were. So the Cazimi is very important and a very pivotal moment in this cycle because it begins the next one. So they're full of power insofar as the planet is concerned. And talismans for the Cazimi period are very difficult to get because you would kind of think conceptually that the talisman for a Cazimi planet needs to match up with the rest of the planetary talisman requirements, right? Like you'd want it to be Cazimi, but you'd want it to also, so within 16 minutes of the sun, super hard to get, or you'd want it to be angular in the 1st or 10th, and then you'd want the moon to be applying to it, and then you'd want that to happen during that planet's day and hour. Super difficult to get, like, literally the stars have to align in such a way as to allow it, and it's super hard to do. So I tend to be on the side that's like, the more kind of conservative side here, that, you can't really get Cazimi talismans, are just super hard. But I'm also, this is something that I've gone back and forth about for a while, and I'm still not super sure where I land on it. Though I think it may be more logically consistent to adopt this other view, that the Cazimi combustion, the whole synodic cycle, occurs outside of the zodiac. Really, like there's nothing that a zodiac sign can do to really comfort the idea of a planet dying, being reborn. That's a really harsh cycle that a planet goes through. It's stripped of its old, where it's like this planet is purified. It's just, completely stripped clean of all the gunk that it carried through its last cycle, and it begins a new one, start off fresh out of the wash. Like that happens regardless of what sign it's in. So it's a little bit difficult then to kind of force zodiacal or other kind of planetary things onto it, like other kind of planetary conditions onto it, because like it doesn't really matter. Though I guess you could argue that there is a difference between like dying at home and dying in a gutter, I guess. So that might be a thing to consider. But this is also why I'm really kind of skeptical of other kind of conventions that mitigate combustion, like a planet being in its own sign, and how that stacks up with other considerations like reception, where planets are open up to things that occur in their signs. So like the idea, basically there's a Hellenistic doctrine where if a planet is within its sign or even its terms at some point, in some cases, combustion is not as big of a deal because the planet's kind of like shielded from it, like you have an umbrella in a chariot. But that doesn't really mesh very well with like reception doctrine, where a planet is more open to things that occur in its sign. So on the one hand, you have this kind of like this Hellenistic idea where you have a planet chilling out under an umbrella, and it's like, this is fine, this is great. But then you have, on the other hand, the reception idea, where a planet is more open to this happening to it. So your imagery on the one hand is the chariot with the planet under the umbrella, and the other hand is like somebody getting attacked in their own house, which is kind of rough to reconcile and difficult to kind of conceptualize too. So there's a lot of kind of different thoughts on this, not only like when it happens and as far as like the measurements for when they happen, but also kind of mitigating factors. So I kind of dropped my thread there, but the point that I was trying to get to is, since combustion, Cazimi, and the synodic cycle happens outside of the zodiac and may not even be something that fits well within or is otherwise conditioned based upon zodiacal structures, then maybe you don't need those other considerations. Maybe you don't need the planets to be angular. Maybe you don't need the moon to apply to the Cazimi planet. Maybe you don't need it to happen during the planet's day or hour, because this is a specific moment in time that is seeped in symbolic significance and power. That maybe it's fine to make a talisman for it, regardless of other factors. Kind of in a way that I recommend people do heliacal rise talismans for fixed stars. Like, it doesn't matter really what the rest of the chart looks like, as long as that star is heliacally rising. That's the thing. Like, that's the thing that we're after, because that too is like an important beginning point in a star's life cycle. Well, then, should it not also apply to planets, even though stars and planets have very, very different relationships with the zodiac and with one another. And that's sort of like a more philosophical thing, but this is kind of what I wanted to talk about more in this video, while I don't have a lot of charts to share with you and have more time to do that. So just kind of some food for thought, some different kind of points, both for and against, to consider in some of these questions about, how do you work with these things? Because usually for Cazimis, and I still recommend it no matter what, are since Cazimis have very strong purifying powers, I recommend people clean things like if you have Venus altars during the day of the Venus Cazimi or during the Cazimi itself, clean off your Venus altar, get all the old stuff off of it, get all the stuff off of it. Wash your altar cloths, wash out any vases that you're using to hold plants, wash any Venus talismans that you have appropriately, and just really rethink and reconsider what you're doing for Venus practices and whether they're working for you and what other ways you might re-strategize or reapproach it. I also recommend taking this attitude more about the things also that Venus signifies, either for you or more in general. So Venus tends to signify relationships. So during this Cazimi time, take a step back and think about, what am I carrying with me from old relationships that are no longer here, that I'm no longer in, that I might need to get rid of, that may be holding me back from fully engaging with future relationships or current relationships even. Or, it doesn't have to be specifically with relationships, just that Venus naturally signifies those things. But, think about what house Venus is in your natal chart, or what houses Venus rules in your natal chart, and what your relationships are to those things, those ideas, or those people that those houses represent, and whether or not you're carrying anything with you, or if any of those, or if some of those people, things, or ideas aren't really working well for you, and just kind of clear them out and make room for the next Venus cycle to help fill it up with things that are more positive and more what you currently need to get by. So that's kind of my recommendation. That's always been my recommendation for Cazimi periods, is just a clean house for that planet and what it represents. But I'm becoming more and more open to the idea of Venus, of Cazimi talismans in general, even though they may not necessarily need kind of full talismanic or full electional considerations. But anyway, that is all that I had to share with you guys and talk with you guys about. Not a whole lot going on, but I hope you guys make the best of your Venus Cazimi on the 26th. I know I will. And then I will see you guys all again on the Libra Full Moon.